Hi, so this is the part two of the Camels with Hammer show. I am Dan Finca, host of the Camels with Hammer show, and I'm here with my best friend from college, Bede Hazlet, who is a Benedictine monk. He was instrumental when he was in a period of doubt while we were college students together, a period of religious doubt inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche. It was inspired me to go read Nietzsche. Bede is openly gay and yet celibate as a monk. And he is we're discussing the homosexuality, morality of homosexuality in the church's role in defining homosexuality for many people, and how the church understands, how the Catholic Church understands homosexuality. And what John is arguing, I call him John because that was his name before he became a monk, and he says I'm allowed to call him that. He says that he's arguing that the church is always evolving, that it has room for a progressive revelation. Not I'm saying that's progressive, that's a loaded word, but progressively understanding God and having moral change. And I'm arguing that the church has been so far behind historically that there's no evidence that's being especially guided by God. And John is starting to concede that the church is like other human institutions in coming to learn. And what I'm saying is that unless there are special indicators that God is especially guiding it towards truth and especially guiding it towards morality, such that we find in the church, insights into truth and morality that are ahead of the curve instead of constantly seemingly behind the curve as it looks, especially in our day in which the church is so responsible for so many ruined lives of gay people, including so many suicides, traceable to Christian teaching and Christian attitudes and Christian institutions. I'm saying these are signs that the church is not even a particularly morally good institution, let alone one especially guided by a morally divine being, a morally perfect being who loves humanity. It seems like it's not even passing the test of a minimally good institution for guiding morality, but in fact an authoritarian, arrogant one that can't even admit its mistakes, let alone be an engine of progress. And so I take that as evidence that the church is false, not guided by a divinely morally perfect, omnipotent being. And I'm asking John to explain why he thinks that it is.
Well, I mentioned a few minutes ago before we were cut off what you might think of as the role of the saints in the life of the church, that there are these examples of people who are sort of morally ahead of the curve, who have insights that are ahead of their time and who live by them. That's important, it seems to me, but it's also important to recognize that the church, as I understand it, doesn't pretend to stand on its moral credentials. And to me, part of what's most compelling about it is not so much the way it behaves as an institution, but the thing that lies at the heart of the tradition, just this understanding of God as human in Jesus Christ. God as present in the created world as a creature, and as having gathered up the natural world that we live in into God's own life. The whole sacramental understanding of how the universe can be, if not transparent to God, at least translucent, and how one's relationship with God unfolds in terms of human community and also in terms of our relationship with very tangible material things. The fact that that lies at the heart of the Catholic tradition and is a notion or a set of notions so alien to both of the traditions from which it emerged, the Hebrew one and the classical one, is compelling to me. And I think morally it's important because it gives the church a set of resources for thinking about what it means to be human and how to live as a human being, that are implicit in the Gospels and implicit in the foundational layer of Catholic tradition, but that have never been fully appropriated or realized. That's something that a French theologian mentions, and I don't think I'll mention his name because I don't know if I'm representing his views correctly, but just this notion that at the heart of the Catholic tradition, Christologically, in a Trinitarian sense, and sacramentally, there's an immense cargo of ethical implications and anthropological implications that the Church has, in one sense, only begun to unload or unpack and articulate. So that, I mean, I guess I don't see the development of the Church in terms of the institution's moral goodness as much as I see it in terms of the gradual willingness to overcome certain cultural barriers, including barriers of ecclesial culture, and to take hold of things that have always been there at the heart of the tradition, some of which have just been so challenging that the Church itself has begun to behave like an established institution and has not been quite willing to appropriate those insights. Because this is a tension that goes all the way back in Christianity, that Jesus Christ spawned this institution, or even set of now fractured institutions, and over the centuries they do come to behave like ordinary human institutions, including corruption and paternalism and so forth. And yet there's a great deal that Jesus Christ himself said, or is recorded as saying in the Gospels, taught, and represents, that can't easily be accommodated to the requirements of maintaining that kind of institution. And to me, the way in which those two things have worked themselves out in the life of the Church over the centuries is fascinating and compelling.
But how is it compelling of truth? How is it compelling of special moral guidance? It's an interesting story if you're trying to rationalize the whole human progress as guided in some way towards the good. And if you want to read that dialectic as having a divine hand behind it, and if you were trying to rationalize from that assumption, or if you took that as dogmatically true, but why in the world should anyone looking from the outside see it as anything but maybe an interesting myth about humanity having a divine character in God and Jesus, or something like that, or the divine having a human character? It's an interesting myth about human nature, but where there would be a notion of there being, this is really being guided by a supernaturally omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. Why would such a being again have its own institution be such a haphazard mess and not be the beacon on the hill, not really be, that's specially, like, unavoidably, wow, these are the people who are divinely inspired. I would almost believe, personally, if Plato was said to be divinely inspired, I could almost believe it. Not because Plato's exactly right, he's quite wrong on a lot of things, but I could still see more resources of moral genius there, more resources of had his insights been, really fully appropriated, at least some of them, I could really see something there. But even then, there's still fallibility of the human. So the question is, like, it seems like there's no evidential reason or any preponderance of rational reason to think that this is the most likely candidate to be the vehicle of what you're claiming is a perfectly morally good God's beliefs. Like recently on your Facebook page, you talked about having internalized in your own psychology, you deal with these feelings that this God is like the bigots, the worst of the bigots who you have to deal with, and hates you the way that you feel like they do. The worst homophobic bigots. And it is the case that the people representing your institution are those people. They are the ones who have demonized you for being gay, and in that context, the leap to assume that this God is really there and on your side, it just seems so out of whack with what's palpably observable.
I'm not sure it's fair to say that that the Catholic hierarchy is among the foremost bigoted demonizers of queerness. It's true that there are some fairly unnuanced statements from time to time, but I personally have not encountered outright.
But the attempt to shift blame for authoritarian cover-ups of child rape onto gays is just appalling.
That too is something that's been...
And the authoritarian nature of the institution...
That too is something that's been advocated by a fairly small but vocal minority. Among the Church's hundreds of bishops, I don't think very many have taken that kind of attitude. And in my own experience, the reverse is what tends, within the life of the Church, to be most often articulated, that there is no group definable by orientation that's to blame for the sexual child abuse crisis, but that there are aspects of the Church's culture itself that are part of the problem. Those other voices are very strident and tend to be focused on in the media, but they're not really the majority voices when you think of the Church as a whole. But that wasn't your central question. The central question was more about could you express it again, just sort of briefly to remind me? So I got sidetracked.
Like on what rational basis to say that it's a good belief, if not even a true belief, but let alone even a good one, to say that there's a morally perfect being behind this institution when it is so not special, let alone a city on a hill.
Well, I wouldn't want to say that being is behind the institution exclusively. What I believe is that being is behind the whole universe. And that, too, requires dealing with the fact that the universe itself seems to be a fairly messy, morally ambiguous reality. So I think any belief in God is going to require that you deal with this issue on one level or another, whether institutionally or cosmically. I think it's one of the problems of faith in God. And I tend to deal with it on both levels, cosmically and ecclesially, in a different way now than from the way I would have, say, when we were undergraduates. At that time, as you mentioned yourself, I tended to be very propositionally oriented, very much oriented around trying to distill some propositional statements of truths and hash out whether they're, in a sort of crystalline sense, true or not. I aspired, I think, to a very unpoetic, univocal way of using human language. And in some ways, a basically context-less way of using language. Since then, I've come to think in a different way about all those things. I've come to appreciate, for one thing, that language by its nature and at its roots is poetic. So that everything one's going to say, no matter how much you try to express it in a crystalline, univocal way, is going to have lots of other things that it says at the same time. And I don't want to say that leads me to think in more vague terms about truth claims, but it does lead me to think in a different way about what it means to say something that's true. And it certainly leads me to think in a very different way about myth, for example. A much richer way, seeing myth as potentially communicative of very deep truths, but not in that crystalline, propositional sort of way that used to be so important to me. And I've also come to think in a lot different terms in terms of about how language and community interrelate, and how aspirations to truth and claims to have access to some truth or some wisdom function in community terms. I guess my goal in the past was to get access to a set of propositions that I could strip out of whatever community context they might have originated in, and work out as true or false in a sort of vacuum. That I've come to see as a self-defeating project, and I've come to see this whole way of dialoguing toward the truth in terms of living within and appropriating a tradition of one kind or another in a community of one kind or another. And that, I know that will all sound very vague and unsatisfactory, but that's how I've come to think about this. And to give a lot more credit to what one of your blog readers has called, I think, deep human intuitions about things. That was one of my major issues as an undergraduate. I have these intuitions about, say, logic, but I have no way of establishing them other than by deploying the very resources that are in question, logically. That kind of circularity used to be very, very bothersome to me, very disturbing. Now it doesn't bother me. I see it as just the way human thought, human language works in human community, and if we're going to have any access to truth or wisdom, that's how it's going to be.
But there are ways to check.
Yeah.
Not everything is a self-contained system. You know, some scientific methods of objectivity, logical canons, testing logical consistency. And so one of those tests is if you have, if you do have certain beliefs about what's psychologically and morally good, and then you have a claim that somebody else is making that you concede is destructive or impediment to people's real lives, as the church is taking centuries, there are people who are right now dying, there are people right now being denied their rights to, and their ethical at homeness in the world as gay people. When you see a church standing athwart of that, like there's a contradiction morally there that no amount of poetization or talking about internal coherent systems and communities can deal with. This community harms people.
Yeah, but every human community harms people one way or another. Right,
but none of those claim that they're specially guided by God. None of them put the lever onto their authority that says, don't question us, defer to the church, take things as dogma. None of them, or when they do these things, there's authoritarianism that's so antithetical to people's healthiness. And that's what, so all human institutions are corrupt, but not all of them have built-in mechanisms for bullying people into submission who dissent.
Yeah. But I think that's an oversimplification of how Catholicism works. I realize that that's how it would appear, you could say from the outside, or on the basis of an acquaintance with the Church derived from the news. But experientially, at least in my own experience, that's not how Catholicism functions. There is an authoritarian dimension. There's also a populist dimension. There is a top-down dimension. There's also a bottom-up dimension. And although what one hears about most is the top-down kind of pronouncements, the life of the Church really happens most at much lower levels, the level of parish life, of monastic life in a particular community, for example. And the way in which those things sort of function dialectically is a lot richer than just this draconian, monolithic sort of vision that I could see one having from the outside, and even in some ways from the inside. But I realize that doesn't address your deeper question there. And I'm not sure how to go about addressing it.
Because don't you see where there's a tension where if you are on the parish level and say your son comes out to you as gay, you feel a pressure that I have to differ from the Pope if I accept, and if I go to his wedding and I'm happy for him and I accept his children and I accept, that this relationship is a good thing, then there's this constant tension with the person who's supposed to be the vicar of Christ. And yeah, that's happening in a dialectical way, but I don't see how setting up the institution so this person feels like he's torn between the vicar of Christ and his son is the ideal arrangement or a healthy community.
But I just don't think in terms of ideal arrangements of that kind anymore. I think of a healthy community in more developmental terms, and thinking of it in those terms requires that there are going to be some tensions that you just have to inhabit. If there weren't, there would be no dynamism, there would be no possibility for deepening or developing. And it's true that's difficult. I know that full well from my own experience. But I don't think it needs to be fruitless. That does leave unaddressed this deeper question of, well, what about people whose experience in the Catholic Church, as far as sexuality goes, has been so toxic as to drive them to suicide, for example? I don't know how to address that, because I would see one's experience in the Church as in continuity with one's experience in the human community as a whole. And that has been a part of one's experience in the human community as a whole, too, until quite recently. And I think in practice, the way people in this situation are actually dealt with pastorally tends to be much more sensitive than you might imagine. It does involve the tension of recognizing, well, say trying to get married as a pair of guys or a pair of women certainly is in contradiction to the Church's current teaching about sexuality. The Church would not say you're evil because of that. The Church would say that you're practicing a disordered sexuality. But if you have the courage to recognize that that is a tension within a developing institution, I think it can be fruitfully lived. And I think that in actual pastoral practice, it's usually dealt with fairly sensitively. This will vary culturally,
though. But no matter how sensitively you're dealing, the fundamental choice is only celibacy or apostasy or sin. I mean,
no.
No matter how sensitively you put that choice to somebody, and
but that's not
yes,
the fundamental choice. I mean, there's also this possibility of conscientious dissent.
But that can't be. That's not being acknowledged by the Vatican.
Of course not, because part of the Vatican's job is to discourage that.
Right, but you see the structure of the so you say that you need a dynamic institution. That's fantastic. That's why we have democratic institutions. That's why we have academic institutions that are dialectical. But the problem is the way that those other institutions work to create dynamism is by not having any one person set up as an authoritarian vicar of Christ. You don't have in other institutions the authority to stop someone from having the ability to teach within the institution just because they dissent from the vicar of Christ himself. So it's that authoritarian structure which is so antithetical to this dialectical process, which does put people out on a limb where if they're to be conscientious dissenters, they're dissenting from someone who has a reputation for infallibility. Might be only when he wants to sit on the throne in a certain case and speak infallibly, but the dogma, but the ethos is out there that the guy has the final word, and that ethos is a structural impediment to progress. And even if the progress happens anyway, and even if bold and daring and brave conscientious dissenters are out there anyway, you have a system in which to think the new and brave and morally advancing thought is to be threatened with an implicit threat of excommunication, an implicit threat of sin, an implicit threat that God is against you. And it's getting to the point where the Church would rather shut down its own adoption agencies than even allow non-Catholics to adopt. I mean, it's coming down so strongly against gays that to say that it makes any sense to say this is the institution guided by God, a morally good God who morally loves you, and if you disagree with it on homosexuality, you can still dissent. Yeah, maybe you can, but it's not at all an institution which sets that up to be something that people of normal moral fiber and intestinal fortitude can deal with. And a lot of them are suffering in contradiction, and a lot of them are going celibate, a lot of them are killing themselves and suffering in ways that are so counterproductive and so traceable to the authoritarian structure of the institution.
I'm not sure that that's true, though. And I'm not sure that the way the church is structured is as antithetical to development as you're arguing.
In the popular mind, is it?
In the popular mind, certainly. But in the way it actually
comes from.
What?
But where does that come from? How does the popular mind get so distorted on its own church's dynamism when that popular mind is catechized and the people are forced, as children, they're brought to the church, they have to go through this, and yet
so
they still come out with the
mind.
Misconception. What?
You're talking about the Catholic popular mind, then?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you meant just in the mind of our culture at large. I think in the Catholic popular mind, that's not as big of a misconception, although certainly it's there to be found, in part because catechesis is not always well done. But the reality is a lot more nuanced. I mean, there's a lot of breathing room theologically. It's true that theologians are occasionally asked not to write anymore, but it takes some doing to get to that point. It's very, very rare, even unheard of, for a theologian to be excommunicated for saying something disagreeable. But that whole tension is part of how this works out. I mean, theologians can advocate increasingly radical ideas. At a certain point, they're checked by the intrinsically kind of conservative and stabilizing papacy. And over the course of time, those ideas kind of resurface and get reworked and discussed, and some of them will probably gradually be appropriated. I think that whole process is actually very fruitful in terms of trying to maintain both a pattern of development and a stability and unity as a kind of community, a huge community. And I think the current Holy Father is a good example of this. As a theologian, he was not unprogressive. He himself was in some ways on the theological vanguard in the 60s, understanding his role in terms of kind of advancing the tradition, proposing new ideas. When he began to take on hierarchical responsibilities, consummately now as Pope, his role kind of shifted. I don't think his most deeply personal intellectual commitments have changed very much, but I think the context in which those play out in terms of his role have changed a great deal. You're right, the whole sense of how this works is not very well understood, even among Catholics. And yet that is how it works and is working. So I'm not sure what more to say.
Now, do you is there a lot of? I mean, I asked some of my Facebook friends for questions for you, and one of them said that he worked with a monastery that was Episcopal, and they had a small number of monks, and he said nearly all of them were gay, and he wanted to ask what's up with that. Like, is there a lot of open homosexuality in the monasteries? I mean, a lot of people think the only reason you would be a priest is because, and deal with the burden of celibacy is because you were gay and you didn't have an outlet for that. And related to this, a harsher kind of charge, Andrew Sullivan very frequently will blame the sexual abuse scandals on what he considers to be a sexual arrested development, that the church is not, that the vows of celibacy kind of freeze people sexually at this age in which they're taking their vows, and so or when they're kind of beginning their sexuality and they're kind of suppressing it, and so he thinks that there's that may be some, and it is of course armchair psychology, but this is what he's saying may contribute to their tendency towards identifying with young people and their sexuality rather than adult sexuality.
Well, first, I can only speak about my own monastery. And I don't think it's true that most of us are gay. I think most of the monks of our community are straight. I know I'm not the only one, but certainly gay monks are not in the majority. And I think that's probably true for most monasteries, that maybe there are a bit more gay monks than there would be gay people in the population at large, but I don't think we're a majority. Maybe, I mean, other specific monasteries could be an exception, like this Anglican one your friend mentioned. And I think it's also important to recognize being celibate is not part of the essence of vocation as a priest. It's part of what has been the practice of the Roman Church for centuries, but it's not essential. It's not the practice of Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. Their priests can be married. So it's a disciplinary norm. It's not part of the essence of the thing. And that's something that I think needs to be discussed. It is part of the essence of being a monk. As a monk, you commit yourself to a life of singleness in community, and you really need to have a specific sense of calling to that. And that's something that I find fascinating. I mean, it's certainly a struggle for me to live this way. And yet, my therapist, who is not Catholic, has no particular sympathy for monastic life, although she's not opposed to it, thinks that I myself am just suited to a life of not being coupled, based on our fairly deep plumbing of my personality over a period of almost a year now.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that the idea of you living in a community with, fellow theologically inclined people, philosophical people, men, that always made perfect sense to me. Like when you said you were going to become a monk, I said, like for John, I can see that.
Yeah, that doesn't mean I'm asexual. That doesn't mean I don't have the kinds of desires that would lead me to want to be in relationship with someone in a sexual way. But I think she has a point. And I think that point would also be true of quite a lot of monks. That there are some people who, without being asexual, nevertheless have aspirations or priorities in their lives, or a temperament that would make it quite understandable that they would live in a celibate, communal sort of way. So I don't think there's anything inherently diseased about this way of life. And I think, in fact, for those of us who are, to put it theologically, called to it, it really is a good and fruitful way of life. So there's that.
Monks have a reputation for happiness.
What?
Yeah, monks have a reputation for happiness. So. Yeah,
and as someone who has struggled with depression since puberty, I think I am more content now than I've been since puberty, in a more consistent way. So that doesn't mean I don't struggle with things, but in human life one is going to struggle with things. That's just how it is. But I think Andrew Sullivan, whom I've not read, does have a point there. This is something I've noticed and that I've talked about with other monks, that a life of celibacy in community can be maturing when it goes well, when you try at least to live it with integrity, and the community supports you in that. It can, I think, over the years, make you very deeply humanly mature, and I've seen that as a reality in the lives of some of my own confreres here. On the other hand, I think it can be approached in a way that's basically infantilizing. You never enter into that kind of basic adult relationship of marriage. You never have the adult responsibility of children. You do work, but you don't have to work for a living in the normal sense. You work for the welfare of the whole monastery, but your household is not dependent on your labor. You don't have to worry about things like health insurance, and so forth. And although that might seem superficial, I think those are things that structurally help people to become mature by needing to deal with adult responsibilities.
So there should be a Judd Apatow movie about monks then.
Okay.
Besides the 40-year-old virgin.
Right. And I think, I mean, monastic life is good. It's been very good for me. I think it's the best way of life for me, though I can't pretend to be very mature. But it is risky, like any demanding way of life. Its very potential for helping you to become more fully human, deeper and more mature, has another side if it's appropriated in the wrong way that can have exactly the opposite effect. It can be infantilizing, it can lead to a sort of failure to mature as a human being. And I personally think that this probably does have something to do with this whole sexual abuse scandal. A lot of the priests implicated in it come from a generation of priests who entered the seminary when they were teenagers, and whose whole life, including such development of their sexuality as happened, took place in the context of church institutions. I know some priests who've emerged from that experience and are quite healthy people. But it's an experience that has the potential to have a very different effect, a similarly, if not more drastically, infantilizing effect. If from puberty on you're the son of these various institutions, the high school seminary, the minor seminary, the college seminary, or the theologate, and so forth, I think there is a lot of potential for not coming to terms with your sexuality, especially if the whole question of sexuality is handled in the way that it used to be handled, which was not very helpful, it seems to me, based on experiences described to me by people who've gone through this system. You were basically encouraged not really to think about it very much, more or less to suppress that dimension of yourself. And like most suppressed or repressed things, sexuality has a tendency to reemerge with a vengeance at some point. That culture has been largely dismantled in our own time. There are very, very few high school seminaries. Most seminarians begin their studies in their late 20s, 30s, even 40s or 50s. We don't accept applicants to our monastery until they're at least in their 20s. We kind of expect them to have a bachelor's degree already, although that's not hard and fast. Whereas there was a time when it wasn't unusual to enter the monastery as a teenager. And there again, I know monks who entered in their teens and for whom monastic life has been exactly what they needed to flourish as human beings. But that's not always going to be the case. And in fact, I think there's a fairly high risk in our own cultural context that something very different will be the case. So I think, is it Andrew Sullivan?
Yeah.
Mentioned? Yeah, I think he has a point that the church needs to take to heart, and that I think the church is little by little taking to heart. Sexuality is now discussed openly and explicitly. Teenagers are generally not accepted into formation for priesthood or monastic life, and so forth.
Now, do you think that well, what is there anything like? Because I've heard rumor of there's discussions of there being sort of gay subcultures within seminaries and monasteries. Is there a special connection you have with other openly gay monks in the monastery? Is there anything like? Are there in monasteries romantic relationships of any degree of explicitness, regardless whether or not they're not sexual? Like, what is this like? Is there like a parallel to the larger queer culture? And speaking of gay culture, what is your consciousness of your relationship to the broader gay culture?
Hmm. Well, that latter question is a big one for me, but I'll try to address the first one first. One does hear about a sort of Catholic gay subculture. It's been critically referred to in some church documents, but it's something that I have yet to experience on that kind of a scale. I do feel a certain sympathy with other people, whether monks or priests or lay people, Christians or otherwise, who share this orientation, although I don't really like that word for it anymore. There's a sense of kind of understanding one another on a certain level that just spontaneously happens. So I have experienced that on a small scale within the monastery. Because again, those of us who are gay are in a small minority, at least in my community. And I'm the only one who's out as far as I know. I've not had any romantic relationships within the community, although I have developed friendships. There's a much more familial kind of dynamic, I've found, although I can imagine that happening under the right circumstances. And in fact, there's a big debate about that in the monastic tradition. The pre-Cistercian approach was to think that friendships in the monastery are a mistake, because you're supposed to be learning to love as Christ loved, and Christ loves everybody equally. And yes, there's a subtext of suggesting that they might be dangerous as leading toward sexual implications. In the Cistercian tradition, there was a change. So Aelred of Rievaulx, for example, advocates friendship in the monastery as a way of learning to love as Christ loves. Recognizing, for example, that Jesus himself had a special friendship with John, and suggesting that there isn't an incompatibility between loving everyone and learning to love by loving particular people. So there's an ongoing debate about that in the monastic tradition.
In the larger gay culture?
The larger gay culture is a difficult one, and I posted something about this on Google Plus and Facebook, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. For me, this is a complicated issue because despite my being more or less out at Oxford and participating on a fairly superficial level in gay culture, such as it is, there was something kind of naive and reckless about it, not very integrated with the rest of my personality, I guess you could say. And what I found is that it's the resources of the monastic tradition itself, the Desert Fathers, the Rule of Benedict, just the experience of community life, and the priorities of monastic life, one of the major ones of which is learning to know who you are. Recognizing that you can't become a good person unless you know who the hell you are as a person. If you're going to be laboring away at the life of virtue under false pretenses because you have failed to recognize who you are, it'll be a fruitless labor. That's a major theme in the desert tradition, on which the rest of monasticism rests. So I'm summoned to do that by my monastic life itself, and I'm trying to do that. So it's really been as a monk that in any deep way I've started to explore the whole question of what the meaning of my sexuality is, what the meaning of my desires is. It's really only been as a monk that I've begun the existential work of trying to dismantle this instinctive sense that God is kind of somehow opposed to me or finds me disgusting because of the tendency of my desires, and to get to the point of trying to experience my relationship with God in terms of God's loving me as who I am and calling me to be my best self. Um, I mean, that's an ongoing struggle for me in terms of my prayer life. Um,
On that
so I'm,
theme,
I'm really only beginning to be at peace with the fact that my desires are pretty much exclusively, in sexual terms, for members of my own sex. Um, and that means that I'm only just beginning to evaluate in a sort of more or less mature way, I hope, my relationship with the wider world of people who are similarly oriented. Um, so obviously I have a strong sense of sympathy with it. I'm not sure you could legitimately think of gay people as a sort of persecuted minority, in the same sense as other more strenuously persecuted minorities, but there's certainly a sense of being part of a group that has not been positively evaluated for quite a long time, that's been the object of opprobrium, and that creates a certain sense of cohesion in itself, and a certain tendency to want to emphasize and exploit stereotypes that have been forced on you from the outside as a way of kind of accepting that dimension of yourself, hence camp and so forth. So that has a certain appeal. I definitely have a sense of belonging to that on one level. But I realize that it also has a darker side. I've not been immersed in it in the same way as, say, some of my gay friends have been. And they report to me experiences of competitiveness and unkindness, a kind of toxicity that I haven't experienced. And I'm also very, very reticent to be defined in terms of these desires. I think that was probably a necessary step in the development of our understanding of this way of desiring. That having had to keep it out of view for so long, there's a tendency to want to have it on display at the forefront of things. I think we're now at the stage of needing to try and integrate it with the rest of our humanity, and see ourselves as human first, and gay on some other level of priority. So in a similar way, I definitely see myself as Catholic, in a way that probably defines or describes me more richly than my orientation does. So I'm sympathetic with again, two poles here. The pole of gay culture that wants to sort of publicly acknowledge itself, not feel like it has to hide, and is tempted to define itself in terms of being gay. And also the pole of the hierarchy, for the most part, which is very hesitant to embrace the idea of defining people in terms of their orientation, or accepting the idea of a subculture based on orientation. I'm sympathetic with both of those poles, and I guess what I would be personally aiming toward would be something different from each. Trying to be part of the human project of discerning what it means to be oriented in this way, which, as I mentioned before, is a fairly new project. But also sharing the ecclesial reticence to define people in terms of this way of desiring, and sharing a certain hesitancy to embrace a subculture that might have a tendency to fracture the larger human reality of which we're a part.
now, would you say, okay, so I'm going to ask like several questions because we're running out of time, and so I'm going to give you a chance to give an integrative answer to several points. So these are unrelated questions, some of them unrelated, but I'm just going to throw them all out and give your last remarks. So the first question is, but we'll make the theme here Christianity and psychological health, right? So the question will be this. These will be the questions together. One of my readers asked whether or not you found that your faith what was the interaction between your faith and your mental illness, is as both a help and as an antagonism for it. Related to that, would you be willing to condemn reparative therapy that tries to teach gay kids to be straight? Thirdly, I mean, very recently, your last most traumatic episode was, I believe, a year ago. You had your worst incidents, and then finally, along all of these lines, I guess the fundamental question is: are you trying to understand your homosexuality as still something inherently good and a gift from God that you need to come to terms with in a different way than consummation? Maybe through sublimations, maybe as an obstacle for growth or something? Or are you seeing it as an inherently sinful part of yourself to be expunged? So how do these things about how you find a mental balance, whether or not you would approve of other people taking measures to try and become straight, what is it, and how all of this and your general issues with depression and mental illness, how does this all combine for a picture of the interaction between your faith and your well-being psychologically?
Well, first, on the question of faith and psychology, I think that the best way of putting it would probably be to say that my faith at its best or deepest has been and remains a help in terms of my psychological health. My faith at its most naive and superficial is a hindrance. And I think that naive, superficial level of faith has an idolatrous element that really needs to be expunged. This way of
idolizing what?
Idolizing a God that's too too easy in one sense, but too difficult in another sense. Too easy in the sense of being too like other sort of human authority figures, and difficult in the sense of being super ego-like in the way that those figures can sometimes be. I think getting to a deeper level of faith that acknowledges that I'm loved by God, period, without qualification, and that I've been made by God, so that whatever is essential to me, to who I am, comes from God and is good and blessed and loved. And that aspects of myself that need to change, selfishness, injustice, lovelessness, and so forth, are deficiencies that God is eager to help me to fulfill, you could say. But that God is not an entity that stands outside me and is waiting critically for me to pull myself together and sort of grumbling in the process. God is within me and around me as love, and helping me to become love. Also, I found that in the course of, I've been in therapy before in various degrees, but for the last year or so it's been in a fairly intensive way. And I'm constantly noticing parallels between what I take to be the best of contemporary psychotherapeutic practice, because I have a very good psychologist, and the tradition of the Desert Fathers. There are constantly occasions where my therapist will be telling me something and I'll think, gosh, that's just like what I read in Evagrius Ponticus or the Sayings of the Fathers or something. This whole sense of being aware of your thoughts and their direction and being prepared to arrest them early on before they start moving in a toxic sort of direction. It's very much a part of the desert and of the wider monastic tradition.
Sounds like the Stoics.
In some ways, yeah, probably influenced by them. So I think basically my faith has been a help. The second thing you asked about was faith and mental health and
reparative therapy. Would you be willing to condemn that, the attempt to try and make it straight?
I think condemn is probably too strong a word. I would certainly be strongly critical of it. I can't imagine it being helpful in my own case. But I'm not sure we understand the phenomenon that it's trying to deal with, namely the phenomenon of queerness, deeply enough to say whether it's a good thing or not. I'm inclined to say it's not a good thing. It strikes me as fundamentally destructive. But I recognize the possibility that for some people, gay kind of desires at one point in their life, maybe some gay behavior at one point in their life, might actually represent something temporary that they'll move beyond. But I don't think one can expect that that's going to be the case for most people with those desires. So I think setting up as paradigmatic the idea that if you have these desires, they're an illness to be cured is certainly a mistake that I would condemn. But recognizing that these desires can play a complicated role in somebody's life and might not be with you for all of your life, might not be part of who you most deeply are, that's probably true for some people. So using it as a kind of therapeutic paradigm, I think, is not a good thing. Recognizing the inherent complexity of this whole question of orientation, I think, is a good thing. And then the last question was about my experience last year. Is that right?
Yeah, the experience last year, and then also whether or not you fundamentally come down on the side that God made you gay and you want to come to terms as a positive thing in some way, or fundamentally sinful. Like, it seems like you have a very ambivalent view on whether or not you should hate that part of yourself or own it in some other way. So those two questions.
Okay. Well, basically the way my experience of depression has worked is that it began when I was an adolescent, and has been a constant undercurrent of my life since then, but has flared up more or less seriously at various points. And I think there have been about 3 really major flare-ups. 2, one when we were undergraduates together at Grove City, which you've described. Again when I was at Oxford, and then again almost a year ago, last November. And each one has been worse than the last. Each one has been more serious, has involved more grave thoughts about the possibility of suicide. And I should mention that there have been about 5 suicides in my family within my lifetime, so that's that places you at risk to some degree. So this most recent one happened almost a year ago. Began with just a lot of stress in my life, not with bad things necessarily, but just being very busy, having to deal with some difficult situations, getting very angry about something on one occasion, starting to drink by myself, not a good idea, and then just plummeting into the abyss of despair. It involved, for the first time in my life, hurting myself, cutting into myself, quite superficially, but repeatedly, and thinking very seriously about suicide, and in fact also for the first time thinking very concretely about a means of doing that. I could take this razor blade I'm using to hurt myself superficially and push a bit harder in the right place, and I could achieve this. The monastic community was concerned, but I'm fairly good at displacing that sort of concern. So people would come and check on me, notice that I wasn't coming to things, and I would just explain it away somehow. I'm not feeling well, I'm upset about something, I just need a good bike ride and I'll be okay. And there was a huge sense of sort of having 2 psychologies operating at once. Part of me that recognized that this was not a good or healthy way of thinking or feeling, and that I should take steps to change it, and part of me feeling like that's just how I wanted to feel. That terribly depressed feeling is an insight that puts me in touch with the deeper reality of things, and that I just wanted to follow that to its end, its fatal end. Eventually, someone I spoke to on the Kaiser suicide hotline, which was very important, got me to commit to telling someone else in my community that I needed to go to the hospital, which is something that a very close friend who lives not too far away had also encouraged me to do. So I did. And it was a terribly difficult experience being an involuntary patient for a few days, 72 hours. But definitively needful. And my experience of how monastic community worked in the course of that terribly depressed season of my life made me think even more emphatically that this is a way of life that I need. I'm not sure I would have survived that experience if I were living on my own in an apartment or something, or even if I were somehow coupled with somebody. That's a huge thing to ask one other person to bear with you, especially when you're insistently resistant to any kind of help, which I was until there was kind of a turning point. And the attitude of the monastic community here is that doing what's necessary to help make you psychologically healthy is something they're willing to support and encourage. So I've not been stigmatized in the least degree, quite the contrary. And it's even been suggested to me by some monks that this is kind of a sign of vocation, which is how I take it to be myself. That the fact that I have these struggles and that being in monastic community is a context in which I can work them out in favor of my own mental health, but also live in a way that's fairly stable and supportive and allows me to be fruitful in terms of the various sorts of work that I do is a sign that this is a good way of life for me to be living. So that kind of forced me to recognize that my tendency to romanticize depression is something I need to maybe not get over, but contextualize.
What was that romanticization like, and did it involve theological grandeur?
Some sense of cross-bearing, although that remains, but also a sense that life is tragic, which to some degree it is, that lots of creative people of depth and insight are quite unhappy. So maybe my being quite unhappy is a sign that I might have some depth and insight and creativity. And also this sense of having a dark, hidden, despairing part of myself had a certain romantic appeal. But I was forced to come to terms with the fact that this is a potentially fatal illness. And the more I romanticize it and resist its treatment on those grounds, the more likely it is that it's going to have terribly destructive and even fatal effects. So I've come to accept thinking of it in fairly clinical terms as something to be treated with medication and therapy, something to be vigilant about. And I've also begun to step away from my tendency to romanticize sorrow itself, to think that being a sorrowful, melancholy person most of the time is who I am. I've come to see that if I accept that, it could well lead to my death, and that it's better to aspire to being a fairly content, healthy person, recognizing that there is always going to be this melancholic dimension of myself. It can't be eradicated.
Right, because I remember the way that you had, this is going to be a crude simplification, so I apologize because my memory, but I remember you have coming to terms with becoming a believer by having a very much a theology of the cross, and the idea that what Christianity fundamentally centered around was the idea of Christ's suffering with humanity. And you had a sense of sharing suffering with other people that was very profound to you, and you felt like you turned. I remember you the way I took it was you turned this darkness and this nihilism into a sense that this had given you an insight into the fundamental suffering in existence, and what Jesus represented to you was an ability to link in with the suffering of others, and then this even led to sort of a benevolence towards animals, right? You're leaving. I remember you leaving. Your circumstances of leaving the seminary involved disillusionment over something you had done to protect an animal, and you felt and it violated some rule, and you felt rather disillusioned at the church's callousness about that. And again, so this all connected to a sense of suffering, which made you an empathetic person and not a judgmental one, and somebody who could be very nurturing in some ways, but there could also be sort of a romanticization of suffering that again is a problem with that I have with Christianity, is that it does sort of glorify suffering. I mean, the infamous example that Christopher Hitchens points out is Mother Teresa, who ran her hospice not with any attempt to heal, but to sort of luxuriate in the suffering of people and celebrate suffering rather than celebrate an ideal of wholeness and flourishing. So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that's quite true of Mother Teresa. Although I do think she's paradigmatic in another more positive sense that I don't think we have time to talk about. I still share that emphasis on the theology of the cross. That was a big part of my interest in Luther. But not as a way of glorifying suffering. It's just as a way of flying my colors as being an enemy of triumphalistic Christianity, I guess. A way of insisting that Christianity does not propose that by embracing Jesus Christ, your problems will be solved in some miraculous way. It seems to me that one of the deepest insights of Christianity is that there's something about the presence of suffering in the world that God takes seriously and shares in, and that must not be trivialized, that has to be come to terms with, but that can't be explained away and mustn't be trivialized. So that's still very important for me. And there was for a long time I tended to think that it's kind of like something Woody Allen says at the beginning of Annie Hall, I think, that as long as anybody's unhappy, I can't possibly be happy. I still sympathize with that to a large degree, but I've come to recognize that if I allow myself to luxuriate in my own melancholy, it will basically disable me in terms of my being able to be of help to anyone else, and it could kill me. So I've come to see that working toward my own contentment is basically a necessity if I'm going to be available to work toward the flourishing or contentment of other people. And I do think it's a dark truth that suffering teaches you things that can't otherwise be learned. Empathy, patience, love, ultimately. And I do think that there is some deep relationship between that reality and the fact that suffering seems to be an inextricable part of our experience in this world. Not to say that God causes it or likes it in some sadistic way, but that God shares in it and that it may have a kind of cosmic trajectory.
Okay. And so finally, just to get back to that last question never answered, would gay, good or bad?
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to neglect that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I gave you like 5 things to talk about.
Well, not yet understood, I think, basically. I guess I've gotten to the point where I think of it less in evaluative terms than in terms of its being part of who I experience myself to be. I'm convinced that whatever's essential about me is not going to be evil, and I'm still exploring what that means. That's not a very satisfactory answer to that. certainly I'm strenuously trying to rid myself of the sense that I'm the object of divine disgust because I have these desires. But I still am trying to work out what those desires mean, what they're really aimed toward, both in a broadly human sense and then in a more properly theological or even mystical sense. So I certainly do not try to eradicate them from myself. I don't see them as something inherently sinful. And I'm still kind of, I guess I've learned to be at peace in the midst of recognizing that this is a dimension of myself and of human experience that we don't yet understand, and that maybe I don't need to understand in order to live my life. I embrace it as part of myself. I don't try and expunge it. And I'm still trying to understand it.
When you say, I guess there is one last question in response to that, and then we'll end. Earlier we talked a lot about, in the first video, we talked a lot about how the church is constantly progressing, or has at least the potential within it to progress, that it has mechanisms within it to progress. And that even in the 20th century, the church has finally taken into account an intrinsic value for pleasure in sex. Now the question is, in that whole discussion, it sounded like you had an optimism or a hope that that a future progression would be more embracing of homosexuality. And now you didn't say that, of course. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I do want to ask you whether or not you, well, two things. Are there any points at which you think presently the church is still behind in understanding homosexuality and needs to become more affirmative or more nuanced, that you think, yeah, from what I understand of modern psychology, my own experience, morality, the church still, like, I think this is an advance that needs to become more common, or maybe maybe you could even point us to some authors who are pushing a certain way and you think this is good, we should go there. Then secondly, whether or not you feel even willing to entertain yourself making arguments for an intrinsic goodness, whether or not you think the church has it within it to make that argument, or that it's possible within the current resources of the church to make that argument, that whether or not you would even try it, would you experiment with it? And if you wouldn't be willing to experiment with it, why not? Might there be some intellectual lack of guts there? If you're not willing to go that far, is there a deferentialness? Or do you think maybe over time you are willing to start to, at least as an experiment, see if you can make arguments for the church coming to a fully accepting view of homosexuality and even marriage?
Well, for one thing, I wouldn't presume to say what direction development is going to move in. Because if I were to do that, I'd be untrue to my own vision of how it works. I can't predict where it's going to go, neither can anyone else. Only time will tell. I was trying to insinuate that I think there are some lines of development that are already in progress that could be moved to another stage, to a more affirmative understanding of what it means to be gay, and even to live that way. And I guess, and I don't think this is a lack of guts exactly, but I do have deference for the tradition as it's developed so far, and for the hierarchy and so forth, because I respect the role that all of that plays, just as I respect the role that disagreeing voices play, and the dialogue that then unfolds, sometimes very uncomfortably or even antagonistically. I would not be willing to preach, to sort of publicly teach as Christian teaching, the kind of account of homosexuality that you describe. I would be able to argue for it in the context of theological debate, because I think it needs to be argued for. I think this conversation needs to happen. So without pretending to think that the view that I would sort of argue in favor of is going to be the church's view at some point, I would be very willing to say this view needs to be articulated and dealt with, interacted with theologically, if we're going to move toward whatever developmental stage is going to happen next in the spirit. And that may, again, seem like hair splitting, but I do think it's important that if one is speaking as a representative of the church, one can't really go beyond the stage that its development has so far reached. Well, one can, one probably shouldn't. I think that if you're engaged in theological debate about things, you not only can, but should be challenging. Ideas of a fairly radical, even sort of wacky nature should be aired and discussed as part of the whole hashing out of the question of where development is going to happen. And I think it's very possible that neither I nor people I've interacted with have what's going to emerge as the answer, that maybe the insight is going to come from some completely unexpected quarter and take a completely unanticipated form that will surprise us all.
That's the
So I don't know.
state of the debate. That's an affirmation, and it's an affirmation of a humble, that you have a humble place in the larger discussion.
Exactly.
But are you inclined to advocate out of at least, even if you qualify it that this is just your hunch, would you be willing to, say, or this is your viewpoint, you want to dialectically interact with others, would you be willing to take as your viewpoint homosexuality is, or at least, on some spectrum, I know you don't like the word, but these spectrums of feelings and relationships are good and worth and deserve the sacrament of marriage? Would you be willing to say that even if it's only your own conscience, that you are inclined towards that, and that you want to argue and develop arguments for it?
Well, in my conscience, I really don't think I have the answer. I think that's part of what I'm trying to get at. I do think that our current way of articulating this set of issues is inadequate, both ecclesially and secularly. I'm waiting for something clearer, something more deeply insightful. And I have some ideas about what form that insight might take, but they don't yet take the form of anything I would want to advocate for as my own deepest conviction about it.
Okay. You're not convinced, though, that there could never be a sacrament for gay marriage?
Well, that's actually a different issue. Even if I were to say that gay relationships can be good and blessable, which is something I think needs to be discussed and argued about, and I have very deep respect for people who are living those kind of relationships as Catholics in a conscientious way. I don't think marriage is the appropriate category for it. I think marriage as an essentially sort of heterosexual, potentially procreative institution, understood as a sacrament, is something that should probably remain intact. And that was even my conviction when I was in an Anglican context thinking much more progressively about these issues. I think the nature of desire between the sexes and desire for a member of one's own sex is just very different. So I don't think marriage is the right paradigm to be thinking in terms of.
But what about because if you don't think in terms of marriage, do you at least allow for the adoption of children, so that someone's being inclined towards a homosexual love and homosexual romantic connection doesn't preclude their also being allowed to be have the human experience and fulfillment of children?
That's something I feel very divided about. On the one hand, I think there is something important to be said for the fact that children naturally emerge from the context of men and women together. On On the other hand, I also think it's true that just in the course of human history, children have been reared in highly unconventional sort of environments. That having been brought to birth by a man and a woman, one sometimes ends up being brought up in a very different sort of situation. So I don't know. There again, my ideas would still be very much in flux.
Okay,
I'm sympathetic with both sides of the debate, I guess.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, John, for coming on here. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, thank you for inviting me. And we'll probably do something like this again.
Great. I'd love to have you back. It would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, that's it for the Camels with Hammers show, October 14th, 2012. This is our 4th episode. And I hope to see you next week when I should have on the Heresy Club, a blog run by a bunch of mostly British skeptics and atheists, including several who have made the news quite ambitiously, and they're very excited, and I'm very excited that they're going to be here next week, and they're going to pick the topic, and we're just gonna have a freewheeling discussion that hopefully does not go into free fall about various issues.
It's actually quite fun, Dan.
That they're interested about. So, okay, thanks again, John, and good luck.
Thank you.